Okay, may I get your full name, please? And if you could spell it, that would be great.
Okay, Lisa, Lisa,
Mhm.
Wiggins, Wiggins.
Okay. And if you could talk just a little bit louder, I'm looking at the,
Okay.
yeah, things. Thank
All right.
you. And I'm Suzanne Dennitz, and we are in Roswell, Georgia on October 24th, 2012 for a Religious Lives interview. Okay, what we're going to do is start with your childhood, and by childhood, this section of the interview goes up to puberty, but not including adolescence. So, from birth to, I guess, like about 11. So, what is your earliest memory concerning religion? And if you could recall a specific moment or event, that would be wonderful.
I don't have a lot of memories from childhood concerning religion. I know that my family went to a Southern Baptist church.
Mm-hmm.
They identified as being Southern Baptist up until the time my younger sister was born, and I was 5. And she was born with a birth defect with spina bifida. And so the focus of the family at that point became on her health care. And so we stopped attending religious services, but we would go for Easter and Christmas, and whenever my mother had an idea that we were going to begin to attend on a weekly basis, which we never did. So I would say my earliest memories would be attending the Southern Baptist Church and not feeling very comfortable there. I remember very specifically there was a Sunday school class,
Mm-hmm.
and the teacher was really trying to impart the idea that only Christians went to heaven, and that people of all of other religious faiths would burn in the eternal fires of hell. And I remember being very young, so I was probably 5 or 6 at the time.
Wow.
And my cousin, who I was very close to, was Mormon. And so I asked the Sunday school teacher what would happen to my cousin and her family, and he said, well, she will not go to heaven. And I was devastated, thinking that my cousin and her family would burn in these fires of hell. And I remember crying and going home and thinking that this loving and kind and beneficent God would never burn my cousin and her family. And so I never felt a connection with the Baptist church since then. The hellfire and damnation did not sit well with me. I honestly, from a very young age, felt that everyone deserved love and kindness and an opportunity for eternal life and rebirth. So I didn't realize that there were other religions out there at the time. I just knew that I was not a Southern Baptist.
Okay. And where was this?
This was in Augusta, Georgia. So
Okay.
this was in the heart of the Bible Belt.
Mm-hmm.
In Augusta, Georgia, it is, I'd say 90% of the population is Christian in one form or another.
Right.
In one form or another. And most of them are Southern Baptist or Methodist.
Okay.
So when we stopped going to church, I also felt a disconnect from my peers because I felt that they had more religious education than I did. They knew more about the Bible.
Okay.
They knew more about the stories of the Bible. They knew more. I remember, again, when I was young and I had to recite the Lord's Prayer for a play, a school play that I was in.
Was this public school?
This was public school.
Okay.
And everyone who had been cast in the play knew the Lord's Prayer, but I had to memorize it. So I felt that there was a disconnect from my peers because they all had similar belief systems, or at least they were prescribing to these belief systems and had this educational background that I did not feel that I had.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And were there any practices at home, any religious practices that you remember doing as far as prayer, saying grace, reading the Bible, anything like that?
No, I would say overall, we were a very unreligious family in that sense. We did not go to church services on a weekly basis. We did not have routines or rituals. Although I think that my mother longed for those sometimes, but she was just under an enormous amount of stress being a single mother of 3 girls and one who had special needs. So again, there were times where she would say, we're going to church on Sunday, or she would talk about God. She actually gave me a crucifix for Christmas one year that I still have, that and there was a message inside that said, always remember God's love. So I think that she thought about God and religion, but we were not avid practitioners.
Okay. And what was her church of origin when she was a child?
She was raised Southern Baptist as well.
Okay. And were your grandparents religious people?
I would say not. I would say that they were unreligious folks as well. Now again, they liked to talk about God, but they did not practice.
What would they say when they talked about God?
Well, they would say that, God loves you, or God does not agree with that, especially when I became older and started to try on different religions and investigate different belief systems.
Right.
They would say, well, that's against God's will, but they never went to church either. So
you had them there.
Exactly. So I'm not sure how their relationship with God influenced these decisions, but I would say that they were very unreligious as well.
Okay. Now you said that Augusta was about 90% Christian.
And still is.
When you were a child, did you have any association with people of other religions?
Other than, no. There were different sects of Christianity that I had exposure to. So the Mormon faith, with my cousins being Mormon. And then my father's mother was Catholic, which caused a huge stir within that family. She also married a Baptist and was not able to practice her religion because he would not allow it. In fact, when one of her dying wishes was that she be married with her rosary. Buried with her rosary. And her husband refused to let the rosary into the coffin. And so my father said that he had to sneak the rosary into the coffin to honor his mother's last wish.
Wow.
But she was never able to practice her religion after she was married because those Southern Baptist roots were so strong in terms of that was the only path to God.
Did you ever have occasion to talk to her about this personally?
No, I did not talk to her. No, we did not mention that.
Oh,
no, that was a taboo subject. So we did not mention the fact that she was born Catholic, and she always said that she never gave up her Catholicism. That she still adhered to that belief system, but she was not able to do so in a public forum, and she was not even able to do so in her private life because her husband did not agree.
Did she go to church with her husband, Baptist
She
church?
did.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting. And were there any influential people religiously when you were a child? Now, this could be, a real person, or it could be, somebody from a book, an imaginary person, or even influential things that you read in childhood.
No, there were not any influential people in childhood, and there were no influential figures. But I always felt a connection with something when I was alone in nature. And so I felt that nature was my influence. I didn't realize it at the time, and I certainly did not realize that there were people who gained religious inspiration from nature. But I would always like to go out into the woods and to watch the changing of the leaves, or to feel the solitude of just being completely quiet and still for a moment, rather than influenced by all of the chaos of life. And we had a lot of chaos in my home too, so just to escape from a lot of that chaos, I found solace in nature. And so that, I think, was my push toward being influenced towards something greater and something different from what I had been exposed to.
Right. Did you have any, what you would consider now, supernatural type experiences when you were a child in nature?
No, not in nature. I think that, as a child, I was very lost religiously because I did not adhere to that Southern Baptist belief system, and I was not exposed to anything other than Christianity. So I was very lost, and I did not know where to go. I did not even know what to explore because there was nothing to explore.
Right.
Now, when I was in high school, which is beyond the age that you're asking about currently, I found my first book on the craft, and I was fascinated by it. And I hid it under my bed, and I would take it out at night and read through it at night and flip through it, and I had memorized the whole book almost. It was the only book I had, and my mother found it and was not very happy with the fact that I had a book on witchcraft under my bed. And it caused for a lot of talk about God, about following God's will, following God's word, and I had to, of course, get rid of the book.
Wow. So you don't have it anymore?
No, but I do think I remember. I mean, it was one of the more popular authors that it was not an academic or thorough review, but at least it was my first introduction.
Okay. And so as a child, if someone would have asked you what religion you were, what would you have said?
I probably would have said Baptist.
You would have said Baptist.
Because
okay.
that, even though I did not believe it, I would have said it because that's what my family was.
Okay.
It's very similar to when people ask me what political view I followed when I was a child, I would have said Republican. I had no idea what Republican was. And I certainly didn't know the difference between a Republican and Democrat, but I knew my family was Republican, and so therefore that made me Republican.
Wow.
And it's the same thing with the religion. I would have said Baptist.
Okay. Well, this is a good segue. We're going to kind of move into that adolescence now. So you've kind of touched upon it. But if you can kind of just give us the trajectory of your views as a teenager and actually moving into adolescence and then into being a teenager, and if things changed with you. Like, where did you find this book?
I'm not even sure where I found the book. I don't remember where I found the book, but I do remember, again, feeling very lost and feeling as if I did not belong. And high school was certainly not a good time for me to explore my religious questions that were coming up. I do know, and I was wild in high school. I think I had this double life to where I was very popular and very, sort of the good girl at school, and then at home and after school I would hang out with people who were bringing me down socially and mentally and everything else. So I had this double life that I was dealing with, and so I was dealing more with finding myself emotionally and mentally rather than finding myself spiritually. And certainly that leaves a void because they all interact with one another. Your physical self, your mental self, emotional self, and your spiritual self. And when you don't pay enough attention to one of those aspects of your life, you're naturally going to feel imbalanced.
Okay.
So I was not paying enough attention to my spiritual self during high school and adolescence. I do know that a lot of my friends were becoming more and more into the Christian faith. So there was one girl I remember in particular who became extremely religious in high school and went from being a wild child to this fanatical Christian. And I remember watching her progression and thinking how I did not want to be that way.
Note to self.
Right, note to self, don't become a fanatical Christian. And it was because, again, her thought process was so limiting. It excluded so many people in the population. It was, it's this way or it's no way. And I could not bring myself to believe that. And she told me one time that if I did not accept God's love, that I would end up burning in the eternal fires of hell. And I thought, wow, I'm still getting the same message that I got when I was 5 or 6 years old, that if you don't believe this way, you're going to burn. And there was something inherently in me that could not accept that thinking, that thought process.
You said you observed her. Were there any life changes? Were there any influential people that caused this trajectory in her life that you could remember?
In her life, I'm sure. I mean, there are several big churches in Augusta that have huge youth programs that are on the verge of cultish, and she was involved with one. Now, I remember being taken. You want a story? This is a good story.
Yes.
So I remember I was in high school, and a lot of my friends were involved in this semi-cultish youth program that was huge in Augusta. It was just massive. And they were very fanatical in their beliefs. And but they would have a lot of fun things to do for the kids around town, and there wasn't much to do in Augusta, Georgia, during this time. So they had this big party out in the middle of a field, and they had a stage set up and bonfires all around, and so all of the kids would go out there and listen to music, listen to sermon, bring marshmallows and hot dogs and whatnot, and cook. And this would be the weekend activity. Now, of course, I never went because, again, this was just not my bag at the time. But a lot of my good friends would go. Mm-hmm. So one of my very good friends convinced me to go one time. And I was excited because I knew I would see a lot of my friends there, and I considered it more of a social event rather than a religious event, which I think a lot of people did initially, and then they became so entrenched in the religious aspect of it. And actually, I hate to use the term brainwashed, but they were highly influenced by these very charismatic leaders, very, very charismatic leaders. So we went out, and I was having a great time listening to the music, interacting with my friends, and then the sermon began. And the sermon was highly geared toward hellfire and damnation, as is typical in Augusta for this faith. And they started to talk about how there were sinners among us. There are sinners among us. There are sinners next to you right now. There are people who do not follow the path of God. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, they're talking about me. And how do they know? But it kept on and on and on. The intensity became more and more intense. And then all of a sudden they pointed to me and brought me up on the stage. And I was horrified. And I'm not sure if someone had clued them in to this fact beforehand, which I think may have been the case, or they had overheard some conversations about why I was there. But they brought me up on stage, and there are about at least 100 people at this gathering trying to convince me that I needed to convert and accept the Word of God. And at first I was horrified, and then I got angry, and I just walked off the stage and said, I'm leaving. And I did.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And I never went back to another gathering again, for obvious reasons.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. But they were very pushy in their tactics, and for young, influential minds, it was effective.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And this was a Baptist congregation or
yes.
a Baptist?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. They still exist today.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's very, very intense.
Mm-hmm. It was.
Now, after because you said when you were a child, you just kind of wrote it off because you couldn't believe that good people would burn in hell for eternity. Was there any point where you saw you were surrounded by Christians where you thought, okay, I'm really going to try. I'm going to try to believe this stuff. I'm going to try to overlook this. Did that ever occur to you?
Yeah, I think it did occur to me a couple of times. And I would say probably more so in high school because my friends were so involved in their youth groups and their churches, and they had cars. So we could go to the youth group functions together without relying on our parents for transportation. And so when your peer group is involved with these activities and you're good friends with them, yeah, of course, I thought, well, maybe I could give this a shot. Maybe I could give it a try. I never felt comfortable. It was this innate feeling that I just did not belong there. And so I did. I tried a couple of good times, and it didn't work for me.
It just didn't take.
Didn't take.
Were there any influential people when you were a teenager, adolescent, religiously? Anyone that influenced you?
Well, I would say there wasn't an influential person until I got to college.
Okay.
But I graduated high school when I was 17 or 18, and then I'd say the turning point in my religious life was when I was a sophomore in college, so I must have been 19 or 20 at that time. And when I got to college, everything changed because I went to a liberal arts college. It was still in Augusta, but I started to actually learn that there were other belief systems, that there were other ways of thinking, other ways of living. And I've always been extremely attracted to academia and knowledge and wisdom. And so I was a sponge, and I loved learning about all of the different subjects in college and about all of the different possibilities, all of the different possibilities there are in life. And my sophomore year, I was taking a sociology class. And the professor was writing an ethnography on a coven in Atlanta.
Okay.
And I remember being fascinated. And again, I had already had at least some exposure to witchcraft from the book that I had found when I was a teenager.
Let me ask you about that real quick. If we just go back, you said you read this book cover to cover, you had it memorized. Did you actually try to do any of the practices?
I did, but I didn't know what I was doing. And I think that anytime you do a practice, that not only do you have to go through the motions, but you have to have an intimate understanding of why you're going through the motions. So I went through the motions, but I didn't get the why. So it was really lost to me.
Okay.
It was lost to me. I'd set up, a little altar under my bed, but I didn't know what the objects represented on the altar, and the intent and the meaning behind doing that is what's really important.
Okay.
So I did, but again, I was young and naive and had no idea what I was doing.
You had a whole life there underneath your
I
bed.
had a whole life under my bed.
Great, I love that. Well, one more thing before we go into your college. If someone were to ask you, like let's say when you graduated high school, if they would have asked you what religion you were, what would you have said at that point?
I probably would have said I don't have religion.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
At that point, I knew that I was not a Baptist,
Right.
but I did not know what I was.
Okay.
I may have even said I was an atheist.
Right, right. And so, well, tell me about this class and what happened then in college.
Well, I remember he would only mention the book every now and then, and he wouldn't talk about it in a lot of detail. And I think he was very wise because he was teaching at a college in Augusta, Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember being fascinated by it. And he invited some of the students to attend a Samhain ceremony with the coven in Atlanta. So, of course, I was thrilled and could not wait. And it was such a mysterious and magical and life-changing night for me. So we drove all together from Augusta to Atlanta, and we had to park at a strip mall because at the time this coven was held in someone's backyard.
Okay.
And we parked at a strip mall and waited for a van to come pick us up, and everyone's dressed in black and it's dark and I didn't know what was happening. And so there's this level of anxiety, but it was a good anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know what to expect, but I was excited to see what would happen. So we went in this van to this person's house, and we walk into the backyard. Everyone's dressed in black robes. They all have their athames and their cingulums around their waist, which are traditional Wiccan ceremonial items. And I was a little nervous. And then I remember this very distinctly, like a flashbulb memory. We were on the back porch, and this woman comes out, and the lights from inside the house were shining down on her, and she was just captivating and gorgeous, and had on her traditional Wiccan garb, and was just so energetically appealing. And what I later found out is that she was the high priestess of that coven, and she's also the founding high priestess of Oak Spring.
Okay.
So she made me feel a lot calmer because I was a little nervous. Now, when we went out into the circle for the Samhain ceremony, I remember thinking two things. One was, wow, there are people in the world who actually think the same way I do about nature.
Wow.
And then two, it's a little dramatic. I'm not sure all the drama is necessary, but I like the concepts that they are at least talking about. So, in a Wiccan circle, and Wiccan circles vary dramatically by where you're at, but there can be a lot of drama. It's like a play. There is a charge or a message that the people who are leading the ritual are trying to impart to the participants. And sometimes the people who are leading the ritual are very dramatic in their approach. Mm-hmm. And this was one of those times where it was just overly dramatic, in my opinion. However, the message just resonated with me. And so I was able to see beyond the dramatics and to really soak in the message. And I thought at that Samhain ceremony, this is where I need to be. This is at least going to open me up into the path that will lead me into a comfortable spirituality. Mm. And so I would say that was the life-changing event.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it was.
So what did you do after this?
Well, I was still living in Augusta,
Mm-hmm.
but I was living on my own at the time. So I became a sponge for books. I gathered up all of the books I could, and I started to learn the why behind the practices. So whereas before I had set up an altar and I didn't know the meaning behind the objects on the altar, why you were going through particular motions, I read all of these books to figure out the why, and I started a solitary practice, and I was very open about it. A lot of people were not happy with this, especially my family. They all looked at it, they were very hesitant. I think that the terms witch and witchcraft have such negative connotations, and there's so much misunderstanding about what they actually entail, that people immediately think devil worship. And when I explain to people that the devil is not an entity that I even recognize, that's a Christian concept, and I don't identify with Christian concepts, then I became, it was even worse at that point because I had rejected God. But people did respect me as a person, and they respected me as in all other areas of my life. So what tended to happen was that I had an amazing support group, an amazing friend group. I had my family in Augusta. We just didn't talk about my religion that often because people thought it was weird and strange, and they just didn't understand it. So,
were there any people that would get you off in a corner quietly that were actually maybe a little bit interested, but they didn't
Very few.
Okay.
And if they did get me off in a corner, the conversation would last probably 5 minutes would be as much as they could take.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they would be more interested in some of my practices if I didn't mention altar, craft. So at that time, I had become very much involved in meditation and honing mental discipline. And so the mental discipline aspect was a lot more appealing to people in terms of having a conversation and learning, because meditation was an accepted practice at the time. Now, meditation is an integral component of the craft. You have to have control over your thoughts in order to practice any kind of magic or to evolve as a spiritual being. However, if I went beyond just the practice, then that's when people got a little uncomfortable and would shy away from the conversation. But they also saw the effects that meditation were having on me. Became much more peaceful and calm. I was able to handle stresses of my life more appropriately. So people saw that I was doing things that had some sort of beneficial effect. And they were interested in learning about the actual practices, but not the actual religion.
What kind of meditation did you do back then?
Back then, I started out, and I think a lot of people progress in their meditation practice. Whenever you start a meditation practice, and I always tell people it's not going to go well initially because we're not trained to meditate. We're trained to think and think and think. But you just have to stick with it. So back then, I started out with guided meditations, with meditation CDs. And then I sort of graduated to, instead of a voice guiding me, just music guiding me. So I would play this one CD that had music, and I would meditate to that. But I would still be guiding myself in my mind. So it wasn't the type of meditation where you try to clear your mind and not think of anything. It was the type of meditation where I would allow my thoughts to carry me through different scenes and scenarios that ended up being very enlightening, because typically we're not aware of our unconscious mind, but if we allow ourselves to sit back and observe it from an objective standpoint, then it can tell us certain things about patterns within our own lives that we can address in order to evolve. And that was what was happening at that time.
Okay. So tell me about, this was when you were a sophomore that all of this started. And did you stay at the school in Augusta?
I did. I graduated. I actually got my undergraduate there, and I got my first master's degree there. So I stayed there. I was there for 6 years.
And what did you get your master's and your undergrad in?
They were both in psychology.
Okay. And what year was this, just to give us a...
It was around 1996.
Okay.
I was a sophomore.
Okay.
1996. And then after I graduated with my master's degree, I stayed in Augusta for a few years and was a therapist, a child and adolescent therapist. So it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I actually moved out of Augusta.
Okay. And so when you graduated college, and if someone came up to you and asked what religion you were, what would you have said?
I probably would have said I'm a witch.
You would have said a witch and not Wiccan. Or do you use
I
this?
actually probably would have said Wiccan because it's more politically correct.
I love it.
And the term witch scares people. So I would have said I'm Wiccan.
Right. Okay.
Or I may have even said I'm pagan, because pagan is even more acceptable than Wiccan.
Okay, so when you moved, can you tell us a little bit about your move to Atlanta, why you moved here, and what brought you here, and then what brought you to Georgia State? And
yeah, so I had a series of negative life events in a very short period of time. But before that, a lot of my friends had moved up to Atlanta. So I had a really tight peer group and of about 5 people. And then all of them had moved up to Atlanta except for me. So all of my very close friends were in Atlanta. More and more people were moving to Atlanta. And I felt a sense of of isolation, and that I didn't want to spend my entire life in this small town that I really did not feel that I belonged in. And then I had a series of negative life events. I was with a man who I really wanted to marry, and we had talked about getting married, and had introduced our families and told them that we were probably going to get engaged very soon. And then we broke up, and that was devastating, absolutely devastating for me. And then within 6 months after that, my mother passed away very suddenly. So I was not in a very good state of mind, and I felt that I needed to get away from everything that I knew and was comfortable with. I had to get away from everything. So I moved to Atlanta. I got a job at CDC. I moved to Atlanta and really spiraled out of control. I was drinking heavily. I was trying to mask my grief and my sorrow. I had a hard time adjusting. I think anytime you move, even when you do have friends, especially from a small town to a large town, and I was in the city, I had a hard time adjusting. And I eventually put myself in therapy because I knew that I couldn't sustain that type of lifestyle. And I was adamant on finding a therapist who would, first of all, accept my religious beliefs because they had become a prominent part of my life and my healing process, and that was open to exploring non-traditional modes of therapy. So I found a wonderful therapist in Decatur, where I was living at the time, and we used meditation as a form of therapy. So what would happen is I would go home and do the type of visual meditation that I described earlier, and I would be presented with a lot of different scenes and images that I didn't understand at the moment. And then I would come into therapy and process those themes and images, and it was so cathartic and it was so enlightening. And it really revealed the massive amount of grief that I was going through because of all of those different transitions. And it was very important in my healing process. So I was in therapy for a year or 18 months ish, and it was profoundly influential. And it really helped me to integrate what I was learning in terms of my religious practice and how it can be applied to everyday life. I think a lot of times people think about religion as separate from their everyday life. They think of the practice of religion as separate from the practice of going through the motions of everyday life. And in reality, those two things are not separate. And that was the first time that I really found that what I was doing in my religion applied to everything else and affected everything else in my life. Now, when I moved to Atlanta in, I think it was the year 2002. So I was in Atlanta in 2002. And the first thing I did was go back to the coven that I had been to with my sophomore sociology professor. And I didn't feel a connection. And it really was disappointing because I wanted to feel a connection. And it reminded me of sitting in Sunday school in that Baptist church. And it's like, but I knew these people believed the same thing that I did, but it was the dramatics. We didn't have the same personalities. It was just not a good fit. So I sheepishly went back to solitary practice and thought, but I was very disappointed by the whole thing. And then 2 years later, and this was after I had been through therapy and gotten to a point where I felt that I was much more stable, I got on the internet and started looking around for covens in Atlanta, and I found Oak Spring. So I contacted the high priest, and he invited me to a ceremony. And I always said that when I stepped onto the Oak Spring property, I felt like I was at home. And I knew that would be my spiritual foundation. It would be my spiritual home. And I was so grateful to find Oak Spring because I felt also that I had reached a ceiling in my solitary practice.
Okay.
And I really wanted to work with people who were further along on the path than I was, people that I could learn from. I really yearned for that. I wanted that exposure, and I wanted those relationships. And Oak Spring has an amazing group of elders who are very open to teaching and are wonderful teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very lucky to find them, and I went to the first ritual that I went to with them was in August of 2004, and then I started classes there in October 2004.
And so how many classes have you been through? Because I know there's different levels. So if you could talk about that. If you could talk kind of specifically, as much as you feel comfortable, just, kind of what you're learning, the practices involved in these classes.
Okay. Well, before you can ask for initiation into the priestesshood, or the priesthood, if you're a male, you have to go through a series of classes. And this is Oak Spring criteria, and also criteria with several other covens, large covens and respectable covens in the Atlanta area. Other covens have different criteria, of course, but these are the criteria that are specific to Oak Spring. One of the reasons why you have to go through these classes is to make sure you know enough about the craft to where you are in a position to ask for initiation with an educated background, an educated mind. So you can't just walk into a coven and say, I want to be a priestess, because you don't know what that means, right? So the classes give you the background to be able to know what that means so that you can make an informed decision about whether or not you want to move further. So the classes are for a year. You meet one Sunday a month for about 3 or 4 hours. And they cover a wide range of topic areas. There are, the basic tenets of the religion, what we consider in terms of our protocol, mental discipline, which is a class that I actually teach now, energy, meta magic, which is very much related to metaphysics, different levels of ritual, myth and symbolism. So those are just the types of classes that you get. And it gives you a really good background into the craft itself, and also very specific techniques and practices that people engage in to further their religion and their religious practice. So after you finish your classes, then at that point you can do two things. Number one, you can ask for a blessing of the children. A blessing of the children is where you take a name, a spiritual name. And if anyone ever goes to a coven, they may notice that people do not go by their mundane names, right? And it can be very confusing. But where I think Oak Spring and Wicca differs from a lot of other religions is that we choose our own names rather than a name being given to us. So, for instance, in some ashrams or some Hindu paths, your guru will give you a name that they feel is appropriate for you. For us, we choose our names because, again, there's a huge level of personal responsibility in Wicca. You are personally responsible for your own religion, and you are personally responsible for the growth of your own spirituality. And so by me choosing my name, I'm inviting those energies of that name to me. And then, of course, it has to be vetted by the council. We are governed by a council. And most of the time they say yes. Sometimes there will be a little discussion. If someone said that they wanted to take the name of Zeus, that might invite some discussion, right? Because we have to circle with these energies.
Right.
And I don't know if I would want to circle with Zeus's energies.
Right.
And then, so that's one of the things that you can do is the blessing of the children. And then the second thing that you can do after you finish your classes is request initiation to the first degree. The first degree, which becomes a priestess and is charged with knowing thyself. So it's really an exploration of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
After you spend a few years, and a lot of people spend many, many years or even a lifetime at the first degree. A first degree, you are committed to the god and goddess. You are committing to knowing yourself, and you can lead ritual. Now, if one desires to request elevation to the second degree, then that's when you are committing yourself to the covenant. You're committing yourself to Oak Spring. It becomes a legal issue at that point because second degrees are considered associate ministers. In the state of Georgia, they have the legal right to marry, bury, and teach. So they can officiate weddings, funerals, and they can teach classes. Their charge is to know. So generally, second degrees have a specialty area of expertise.
Such as?
For me, personally, mine is shamanic work. I consider myself a shamanic witch. I do a lot of shamanic journeying and healing, both for myself and other people. And I have a good bit of shamanic training. Other people, other second degrees could be Enochian magic, the tarot. So it's just, whatever is your interest.
Okay.
The only requirement is that you are, or the only expectation is that you share your knowledge with the other members of Oak Spring. And then the third degree, if you have spent some time at the second degree level and you desire to request elevation to the third degree, third degrees are considered elders. They are full ministers. They are considered the most wise, and they provide a lot of leadership and a lot of guidance for the others in the coven.
And what degree have you?
I'm a second degree.
Second degree.
And I'm a third degree candidate.
Okay. So tell me a little bit more about the shamanic work that you do. Is it with people just in the coven, or do you offer this to other people? And how exactly, kind of, what do you do?
Well, I was introduced to shamanism, I'd say more than a year ago. And it was another one of those experiences where I felt, oh my goodness, this is something that I've been involved with for thousands upon thousands of years and just didn't know it existed. Mm-hmm. And the interplay between shamanism and Wicca, there's a lot of overlap. It's just that you're using different techniques to achieve similar goals. What I have found with craft work is that craft work has an underlying message that resonates very well with me. With shamanic work, the techniques are so powerful and so effective that I've never experienced that much power and effectiveness in the techniques that are utilized. And that's what initially got me attracted to it. With the shamanic work, you're really developing relationships with spirit helpers. And, shamanic work has been prevalent for many, many, many years. Some people say it's the oldest religion. Mm-hmm. I actually do believe it's the oldest religion. And when you look at the core techniques that were used in many different societies, even though they had no contact with each other, they were all doing the same thing. They were using some type of percussion, typically a rattle or a drum, to put themselves into a trance-like state, and then to travel to different realms and access spirit helpers. And the spirit helpers would provide guidance on how to heal self, how to heal other people, and how to heal the global community. Mm-hmm. And so it's really developing those relationships with spirit helpers through the use of percussion and trance work. And those are the techniques that I have been working with and finding extremely effective. Mm-hmm. I do study with folks outside of Oak Spring who are shamanic in nature and have no relationship to the craft. So I study with the Michael Harner Foundation for Shamanic Studies, and that's sort of a larger foundation that has teachers all throughout the country, and there's an introductory workshop, and then you can attend several weekend intensives and longer residential training courses. And then I also have a teacher who is grounded in Peruvian lineage here in Atlanta, and I meet with him once a month to discover and learn and to soak up the energies that he is putting off. He's an amazing, amazing teacher. He really is. I do classes and workshops inside of Oak Spring and outside of Oak Spring. I'm actually doing a workshop on the shamanic journey this Sunday at an earth sanctuary up in Roswell. I've taught at bookstores, Unitarian churches, different schools. So I'm very much community focused, and I've taught both witchcraft and shamanic work in these forums. In my personal opinion, and one of the things that I've said before is that I understand that everybody's situation is different, and I'm not trying to degrade or to demean anyone's personal decisions. But I think it's extremely important for people to be open and honest about their religion, especially if they're a witch, so that we can dispel myths and beliefs. When people look at me, they say, "Oh, she's an accomplished woman. She seems relatively sane and normal, yet she's attracted to this religion, and she finds it extremely gratifying and helpful in her life. So it can't be that bad."
Love it. Love it. Wow. Well, what are some of your daily practices?
Daily
today?
Practices. Okay, well, normally, and I do have a 5-year-old. My 5-year-old, we have...
It's quiet in here for a 5-year-old.
She's not here.
That's it.
I do have an altar. I actually have 2 altars. I have a private altar and a public altar. I have a mesa, which is a shamanic working space. And my daughter has a mesa. She asked to develop a mesa. So we have a lot of working spaces in our home. My daily practice right now, it does revolve around the mesa. So I get up every morning. I smudge to clear the energies. And usually she's there with me, so I'll smudge her, she'll smudge me. I offer gratitude for the day, and then I ask for one teaching or one lesson, or for the spirits to help me on one thing. So, for instance, I work for the federal government. I work with a lot of academics. I work with a lot of people who have huge egos because everyone has a PhD or an MD. And there was one day where I knew I would be in a lot of meetings. And so my request to the spirits on that particular day was to allow me to listen with an open heart and to be respectful in my communications. So every day I offer a bit of gratitude and ask for something from the spirits. And then at night, I'll typically smudge, thank them again, and then release them, except for the ones who want to stick around during dream time. Now, when I can, I do actually journey, which is I'll use my drum and contact my helpers for a variety of different purposes. And then other times, I'll do chakra meditations. It's just whatever I feel like I need that night. But usually the morning is that brief smudging, gratitude, asking, and then at night there's something a little bit more extensive involved, but it differs depending on what I need.
Do you have particular helpers?
I do. I have I have my power animal, which a lot of people will, in shamanic work, sometimes helpers come in the form of animal spirits. And mine is eagle. I adore my eagle. I have a picture of my eagle in my bedroom, in my healing space downstairs, and in my office. So he's constantly around, and I'm constantly reminded that he's there to help and protect and to guide me. So whenever I'm facing a challenge, I can just call upon the eagle. I do have several other animal helpers that come and go depending on the need. And then you have teachers that are not in animal form. One of my main teachers is Ishel. She's a Mayan moon goddess. I actually met her when I was in Costa Rica, and I met her in a cave when we were doing a cave exploration of where the Mayans did their ancient ceremonies. And I feel like she came back with me, and she's stuck with me ever since. But she is an amazing teacher. She gets down to business very quickly.
Now, how do you when you met her, did you see her visually? Were your eyes closed, open?
I kept hearing about this Ishel goddess when I was in Costa Rica, and I kept thinking, well, why am I? Usually, if something keeps presenting itself over and over, that to me that's a message.
Right.
So I asked one of our guides, who is this Ishel? And they said, oh, she's this Mayan moon goddess. She has 3 aspects, maiden, mother, and crone. And I thought, oh, that sounds familiar from my Wicca training. And then when we went into the cave, this cave where it was actually a really amazing experience. We had to hike about a mile or 2 through the jungle. Then we had to cross over several rivers before we got to the mouth of the cave. We had to swim across to the mouth of the cave, and then it's pitch black, so we had our little headlamps on. And then we had to traverse through the cave through rocks. We had to climb up rocks, climb through these small spaces. There were points where the water was up to our waist. There were points where it was just running below our feet. But what we were doing is that we were following the path of the Mayans, and we were going to their ceremonial site. Mm-hmm. And when I was in the cave, I felt this presence. And it was very protective, and it was very loving, and it was very calming. And I had just asked the guide about Ishel before we went into the cave, so I had a suspicion that it was her. Mm-hmm. And then we had to climb up to the ceremonial site, and they had a lot of the original artifacts there still. And again, it all looked very Wiccan. But there, when we got up to that part, there was this image in the rocks, and I knew it was her. And I asked him about it, and he said the Mayans, in pitch black, had carved this image of Ishel. And it's this beautiful, it's huge, beautiful image of her, and it was the first thing I saw when I got up there.
Wow.
So I did visually see her,
right,
but it was in a carving that the Mayans had done.
So when you communicate with her now, is it a mental thing? Do you talk to her? Do you hear her?
I do, but in what I call non-ordinary reality, and these are the realities that you can access through trance and through percussion. When you're in non-ordinary reality, your senses are definitely engaged. So it's not like you're asleep. When you're asleep, some of your senses may be engaged when you're asleep, but you're not exactly in control, right? So when you're in non-ordinary reality, you're in control, your senses are engaged, but things are a little different, It's like being on the other side of the mirror. And so I can see and hear and smell and taste, and I can sense. So there's a telepathic communication, and there's a verbal communication.
Okay.
So for instance, with Ishel, she has spoken to me both verbally and telepathically, whereas Eagle only speaks to me telepathically.
Okay.
And it just depends on who you're talking to. The messages in non-ordinary reality are a little bit hard to decipher. Sometimes they come in metaphors, and you have to try to, to figure out their meaning. But the more and more you practice, the better you are about learning how the spirits communicate.
Can you give me an example of like a metaphor that you received?
There was, when I was in a training class, we had to pair up with people we did not know, and they were going to ask a question, and then we were going to go on what we call a journey, and that's accessing non-ordinary reality, to try to get answers to their question. And this is called divination, right? So a woman asked me what her purpose in life was.
She'll give you an easy one.
I thought, oh my goodness. Yeah, exactly. So she asked me what her purpose in life was, and I had done these types of journeys before, but never with someone that I had never met before. So, to make a long story short, after several different areas that I knew were for me and not for her, and I kept saying, "We're here for her, we're here for her," we showed up under a waterfall, and there were a lot of adolescents under the waterfall who looked really terrified and were sort of showering away fear. That's what I felt, you know. So that's not something that was communicated directly to me, but by the looks on their faces and the fact that they were standing nude under this waterfall, I got the fact that they were trying to wash away something. So this is the type of communication that you're given, and that's why you have to be patient and figure it out.
Right.
There was also a sense, I saw her sitting with a child at the edge of a lake, and she was taking the child's hand and running it through the dirt and running it up the flowers, like she was trying to get the child to feel the beauty of the earth. Mm-hmm. And then there was a group of children who were playing kickball. So from all of this, I got the fact that her purpose in life was to work with children and to really help them eliminate fear and to be able to see the beauty through the tactile senses.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, she had just accepted a job as an art therapist for abused children. And so she was so happy with that communication because she said that she had struggled with the decision on whether to take that job.
Wow. Oh, that's wonderful.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Mm-hmm. So are there any other, how often do you go to the coven? Because I did realize how far it is a drive for you.
It's quite
oh
a
my
trip.
gosh.
And, well, in the fact that I'm a single mother, mm-hmm. and so if there is an event on a weekday, mm-hmm. which typically the full moons will fall on a weekday, then I am not going to go to the coven. It's just impossible. Right. It's impossible. I do try to attend every Sabbath. Mm-hmm. So the Sabbaths are held on the Saturday closest to the actual day, so that is more convenient for my schedule. And I do teach the classes. Mm-hmm. And I also try to attend other events. So normally I am there twice a month, probably. Mm-hmm. I would say that's probably a good average.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you had said that you had gone to Georgia State. So can you tell me a little bit about what you were doing there? And
yeah, so after I moved to Atlanta and I took a job at the CDC, I worked there for a few years before I realized that I had not only hit a ceiling in my spiritual life, but I had hit a ceiling in my career. Mm-hmm. And in order to move beyond that, I needed additional training and experience. So I decided to go back to get my PhD, and I went back to Georgia State. I worked part-time at CDC while I was at Georgia State finishing my PhD. And that was the affiliation.
And so tell me about a little bit about your experience at Georgia State. Did that have any influence on your spiritual life at all, being at Georgia State?
I wouldn't say so. I think that again at that time I was very open. Mm-hmm. I've always been very open about my religion and my practices. So everyone knew that I was a witch. Mm-hmm. But they accepted it. Atlanta's a little bit more open-minded and liberal. I did have a lot more conversations about my religion after I moved to Atlanta. Genuine conversations where people were interested and engaged. Mm-hmm. I even had a friend of mine who was Christian ask me for a book so that she could better understand my religion. Oh. And I did. I gave her one and recommended one. I'd say the biggest influence about being at Georgia State with my religion was that, and I don't think this is specific to Georgia State, but I do think it's specific to PhD programs. They are so intensive, and you are working so much that I constantly had to draw upon my religion to help me find balance. I was not very balanced at that time. I don't think that you can expect to be. I knew that I was not going to be very balanced. I was going to be working much more than I was doing anything else. That's the nature of a program.
Mm-hmm.
It's the nature of a graduate program. But I did have to draw upon my religion to find balance when I really felt that I needed it.
Right.
When I really needed to reduce stress or to calm, I would have to fall upon, especially all of those mental discipline techniques that I had been practicing for so long.
What did you do your thesis in?
Well, my thesis was my thesis was in at Georgia State. They were all involving autism. So my thesis was in screening for autism. My dissertation was in profiles of toddlers with autism and how that affects screening and diagnosis.
Now, is there anything, do you, in your work now and in your spiritual work, is there any coming together with this? Because, I just keep thinking of the way that autism manifests in someone's life.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that some of the practices you do can either help you get a better understanding of where these children are coming from and what can help them, or B, that some of these practices that you do could help them or their parents?
Well, I think that the practices could definitely help their parents, especially in terms of balance and stress reduction. In terms of autism, and if you asked, if you went to Peru and asked a shaman what causes autism, they think any form of illness, physical, mental, psychiatric, any form of illness is a result of displaced energy. And so, replacing the displaced energy would cure the problem. I adhere to that belief system on a certain level. I think that removing the displaced energy can help improve some of the symptoms. But I also realize that autism is a brain disorder, and that after a certain point in development, the functioning of the brain is very hard to return to a quote unquote typical state.
Right.
So I think that even though you can use some practices, especially the shamanic practices, to alleviate some of the symptoms, it's not going to cure the disorder for most children.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that the practices can be used to alleviate some of the more behavioral type symptoms, especially those that involve self-injurious behaviors or repetitive behaviors, and some of the anxiety that's associated with autism.
Okay.
Yeah.
Back to Georgia State just for a second. How would you characterize the religious environment at Georgia State?
I don't think there is one. Well, I didn't see one. Georgia State's an academic institution. Everyone's competitive. Everyone wants to excel academically. And so, in my experience with being at Georgia State, I went there for an academic reason. I did not have exposure to religion unless I brought it up and people were interested in the fact that I, was Wiccan. But especially in a PhD program, we did not talk about religion much.
It's just like, no, we're not going to go there.
No. Yeah. And I will mention, and since this is about my religious life, in addition to the coven and the shamanic work, I'm also intimately involved with the Unitarian Church.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. One of the reasons I sought out a Unitarian church is because I do not want to expose my daughter just to one belief system. I want her to be exposed to a variety of different belief systems so that she can choose for herself one day what she believes. And I think that the Unitarian Universalists have an amazing religious education program for young kids. They teach morals and values and spiritual foundations rather than a particular set of dogma. So I found a church that we could go to so that I could enroll her into the religious education program. and then found that the principles that they live by, again, are very much related to the principles that are in our tenets for
Wow.
the Wiccan tenets. And it really, they're the same principles that I longed for in childhood.
Mm-hmm.
The respect for all human beings,
Mm-hmm.
the understanding that there's not just one path, there are many different paths to God, and that we need to be able to respect and to accept all of those different paths. The understanding that everything in life and everyone in life is interconnected and interrelated. And those are the principles and the tenets that I have been gravitating to my entire life. And I think Wicca, Unitarian Universalism, and shamanism all hold those to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm attracted to all three of those practices.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. I mean, you're very, very good at explaining all of this. Have you had any particularly powerful religious or spiritual experiences that we haven't yet discussed? Like anything else? You've had some good ones that you've actually given us.
Yeah. Well, I've had too many to discuss.
Yeah.
I've had too many to discuss, and I will say that that a lot of them come about in the shamanic trance work. The teachers in non-ordinary reality will expose you to parts of yourself that are difficult to sit with.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to be able to close one door in order to open another.
Mm-hmm.
And so sitting with those parts of yourself that encourage stagnation is difficult but necessary in order to facilitate growth.
Now, what do you mean by that? If you could encourage stagnation, what do you...
Like fear.
Oh, okay.
Fear or anger. Those are two emotions that a lot of people don't like to sit with. They feel fearful and angry, and they want to push that emotion away. But you can't understand the root of that fear or anger until you sit with it and allow yourself to be fully drenched in it. And it's not comfortable at all. But then when you realize, oh, I'm scared because I think that I'm unlovable, and that's an irrational thought, then that is something that's going to allow me to replace that irrational thought with something a little more positive, and will allow me to grow as an individual and as a spiritual being.
Mm-hmm.
Those types of experiences, they come in a variety of different forms. They come in a variety of different stories, but the result is the same.
Okay.
The result is the same. You have to be able to really know yourself and understand yourself and work with your spirituality, work with your religion, integrate that into your daily practice, and only then will you grow.
Mm-hmm. Do people's daily practices in the Wiccan community, do you think that they vary a lot?
Oh, I don't think that two are the same.
Okay.
But again, it goes back to individual responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
If I am in control
Mm-hmm.
of my religion and I am in control of my spiritual growth, then what good is it going to do for someone else to tell me how to practice?
Right.
Because then I'm following their belief system, I'm not following mine.
Okay. Now, how do people, because you're very open with your religion, how do people at work, does anybody ever ask you questions about it?
Rarely, but yes. And again, they're a lot more open-minded.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll do things. I had a colleague who had a daughter with a pretty nasty birth defect that threatened her life. And they were in ICU for 2 or 3 months. And I went to visit her in ICU and brought her an elephant toy. And in the card, I explained how in some cultures and in some religions that elephants are revered as the remover of obstacles. And this is based in Hindu. And that by keeping this elephant next to the baby, that it could potentially bring in some energies to remove the obstacles that she was facing. So my colleagues know that I do things like that. They understand this. And she was profoundly grateful.
Wow.
And told me so. And I do have colleagues that are, Facebook friends, and they'll say, "Oh, I saw that you're teaching a class on the shamanic journey this weekend. That's really interesting." And so they'll engage me in that type of conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I do have people that I consider friends at my work, and they were invited to my daughter's Wiccaning, which is sort of a blessing for young children. And so they have actually been to my coven.
Mm-hmm.
They were there, and they met my religious family as well. So I do get conversations, but again, it's not a focal point. When we're at work, we're generally talking about work,
Right.
but every now and then it will come up.
So if there was something that you would like to kind of say to people that are not practicing Wiccans to maybe clear up any misunderstanding, what would it be? What would be kind of a message that you feel like you would like to give?
Well, first of all, I would say that it is not devil worship. That the devil is a Christian concept, and it's a concept that we don't recognize. I would say that Wicca is a beautiful religion that gains inspiration from nature, gains inspiration from the cycles within nature concerning growth and death and renewal and rejuvenation. That it's very practical, and we can use the techniques to rejuvenate our own lives, to grow within our own lives. That it encourages respect and understanding of a variety of different people and paths and walks of life. That it really honors the interconnectedness of all living things, and that it is it's a profoundly influential and beautiful religion that is filled with love and peace and understanding, rather than a lot of the myths that surround it.
Okay. And what would you say would be the kind of the best things that you've taken that Wicca has done for you?
It has provided me with a sense that I'm not alone. I'm not alone in my belief that all people deserve respect and love. And that is something to be celebrated.
Well, are there any other questions that you feel I've left out, or anything else that you would want to tell me that would facilitate my understanding?
I don't think so.
Yeah, this is great. Well, I just have to get some final demographic information, which we do at the end.
Okay.
What is your occupation?
My technical job title is an epidemiologist, but I like to say that I'm an epidemiologist and developmental psychologist.
Okay. And when and where were you born? Birth date?
August the 11th, 1976, in Augusta, Georgia.
Georgia. And how do you describe your ethnicity?
I am Caucasian.
Okay. And your educational background?
I have a PhD and 2 master's degrees and a bachelor's degree.
Okay. And your PhD is in
Psychology.
And your marital partnership status?
I'm divorced.
Okay. And you have how many children?
1.
One. And what is your current religious affiliation?
I'm Wiccan.
You're a Wiccan. Great.
Actually, I'm a UU shamanic Wiccan.
That's great. I love it. Well, thank you very much. This was really wonderful.
You're welcome.
This was really, really
You're
good.
welcome.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming out, and I hope it was helpful.
Oh, totally.